Well, good morning. My name is Josh. I'm the teaching pastor here, and we are in probably my favorite series we've ever done. It's called The Story. And if I was going to explain the story to you, I would say to look at our graphic. I got to brag on our graphic designer for a second. You might know her. Her name's Kathleen. She's a worship leader. And so basically the main idea of this series is that there's a story woven in and through all of the other stories of the Bible. And so you might know all these big stories, right? Like Moses parting the Red Sea, David and Goliath, Jesus at the cross. You might know all these stories, but there is a story that is woven in and through all of those stories, one story that all those little stories tell. And our graphic, these icons are called single line drawings. So they're one line that has that the artist never picks up their pen or their pencil. They draw this drawing with one line. There's one story, one narrative, and each of these icons kind of represents a story that we're going to be going through. And so if you're like, what is this series about? Well, just look at the graphic, because there's a lot of different stories, but there's one line through all of the stories. And if I was going to summarize what that one line is, I would say it kind of goes like this. God is in pursuit of humans. That's very basically what the story is. God, who dwells in heaven, who created the heavens and the earth, who is righteous and pure and holy, is in pursuit of broken and messed up people like me and you. And that's kind of the beauty of Christianity. What God did to get us, man, that's the stuff. So today, we're going to be in kind of the beginning of a series of stories in Exodus. If you've been with us, you know that we kind of started in creation, and we've talked about Abraham the last few weeks. This week, we're beginning sort of what can kind of be called the deliverance narrative. It's the story of Israel being delivered from slavery. Now, after I preached last service, I realized that I'm making some assumptions that I need to make clear so that we can kind of all be on the same page before we kind of talk about this. One of those assumptions is that the world it doesn't work like it should. There's something wrong with the world, right? That's not weird. You could probably accept that. People don't do the right thing sometimes, and that leads to pain in other people. It leads to pain in themselves, and it hurts the heart of God. There's a brokenness to reality. And many different religions and different philosophies use different words to describe that. In Christianity, the word that we use is sin. Sin is the reason that things don't go the way that they should go. Sin is the reason why there is pain and death and brokenness in the world. So that's kind of assumption number one, is that we all kind of understand this, that one of the reasons that the world is so hard to live in and that life very often is painful, the reason for that is sin. And you know, sin is kind of a hard thing to talk about because people are kind of like, oh, that's not nice, you know. And I'm really not making fun of you. I really, that sounded very disingenuous. But I really mean it. There is no alternative. Here's what I mean by that. There's no other religion. There is no such thing as a religion or philosophy that says the world's great. It's perfect how it is, you know? And if there was, you'd be like, well, that's dumb because it's clearly so messed up, right? So here's the thing. Just because we talk about sin doesn't mean that we're going to weaponize that and use that word to judge you and make you feel less, okay? But we do need to recognize that there's a problem, because very often with problems, if you don't deal with them, then they just grow. Has anybody ever had a budget problem? Yeah, those things just balloon very fast. So you can kind of understand what I'm saying here, that sin has kind of broken the world. Now, here's the other assumption that I'm making. We all struggle with sin. Ugh. You know, like we do. So here's the thing. There are two kinds of people. There are people who know that they struggle with sin and people who don't know that they struggle with sin, but all people struggle with sin. So there is something, you know, there's one of the best teachings I've heard on this is that everybody kind of has sort of three pet sins that we love, you know, and that we routinely go to. Okay? Now, here we just said that sin has broken the world, has caused death, pain, and division and destruction. We all also have sins that we struggle with. Sometimes we're less aware. Sometimes we're less honest. Sometimes we're just kind of trying to cover that all up. But that doesn't mean that we don't struggle with sin. So this sermon today my big idea, we can throw that up here. Here's the big idea. The thing that I want you to remember from these stories that we're going to look at is that this story is your story. It's your story. This story that we're going to go through about the deliverance of Israel, in the New Testament, Peter and Paul latch on to this story, and it seems to be for them a blueprint for how God delivers his people over and over throughout human history, but also in the gospel. And so here's my point. This story that we're about to tell, it's kind of like the blueprint for your story. What we're talking about is the deliverance of Israel from slavery, but this is also your story because we all struggle with sin. And sin affects our lives in some way. And so I wanted to start with those assumptions today because I really think that if we don't acknowledge this, then kind of what I have to say today is it's just going to go, because it's like, well, I don't really care about that because I don't really struggle with sin. You do. So, good. Now we got that out of the way. Okay. Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to go through chapters 1 through 17. So start getting excited about that. Oh, thank you. Okay, if you know me, and you've come here for a little while, you know that I like to preach 6 sermons in one sermon, and I don't actually like to do that, but that's kind of what happens, because I always have too much to say, and it irritates me. This is chapters 1 through 17. There's a lot here, okay? And so here's what we're going to do. We are going to cover the highlights, okay? And so I want to tell you right away what kind of the path that we're going to take, okay? First, we're going to look at the problem. Every good story has a problem to be overcome. We're going to look at the problem. Then we're going to look at the plagues. Who loves plagues? Everybody. Then we're going to look at the plagues. Say problem, plagues. Then we're going to look at the Passover. The Passover. And then finally, we're going to end up with the parting of the Red Sea. You like how I got 4 P's in there? I'm pretty proud of myself. I'm going to sleep well at night. Thank you. So anyway. So it's like one of those things, how am I going to do that? 4 P's, nailed it. Okay, let's dive right in. We're going to look at the problem. And I kind of just talked a little bit about the problem, but this right here, this is going to make the problem so much worse than how I just described it. It is way worse. All right, so let's jump into, this is Exodus chapter 4, verse 21. We're looking at the problem. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. I love that phrase. He put miracles in Moses' power. Ooh. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, God's basically saying, I'm setting up Pharaoh so that you can deliver this message, because this is the key message of the Passover account. This is the key message of this story is this. Thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. I want you to see this because this kind of summarizes the problem and kind of how God feels about the problem. Here's how God feels about the problem of sin and slavery of his people. He sees you and the people of Israel as his children. So God's fundamental view towards sin is that of a father whose child is enslaved by something. Okay, this is really important because sometimes in church we preach a God whose fundamental view on sin is that you suck, and you've sinned, and so you're really dirty, and there's nothing we can do about that. So you're just going to have to go straight to hell. Whoopsie. That's kind of like the message that we preach in Christianity. So here's the thing: we have to supplement. That's true. Like if you don't, if you're sinful, there is an impurity. That's definitely in there. So I'm not shying away from that, but I have to say that's not the whole truth. God sees sin and slavery. He sees these things as a father with a child who's struggling with this. We have to understand that this is how God views us when we struggle with sin. He views us through the lens and the eyes of a father who loves his son. Here's the second thing, though. I want you to see how bad the problem is. Because Israel is enslaved. They're enslaved. So that's their problem. Now, here's the big thing. Remember, the big idea that we've said is that their story is our story. I want you to know this. Israel's problem is our problem. They're enslaved, so are we. That's the problem. Okay, this is very clear in Romans 6. Paul talks about this. He says, do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves to whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness. Paul views sin as slavery. He views it as slavery. This is a common theme. If you read Romans 6, 7, and 8, an extremely common theme for how Paul sees sin. Now, here's the thing. That's a little bit weird to talk about in church, because our dominant views on sin are right or wrong, true or false, and we very often either neglect or forget that another way to view sin is free or slave and free. And so here's the thing. I want to focus on this a little bit because this kind of illuminates how beautiful, how big the problem is and how beautiful the deliverance is. It's okay to see sin as right and wrong. Every sin is wrong. Yes. It's okay to see it as true and false. Every sin has a lie in it. Yes, that's very true. But here's the thing. Sin is also about slave and free. It's also about slavery. So how does that even work? Well, I want to show you another thing Paul says about it because it kind of helps illuminate it. This is from Romans 7. Paul says, "For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For I have the desire," this is so key, "I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out." He's saying, I want to do the right thing. I want to live in righteousness. I want to love people sacrificially. I want to follow and obey God in every single thing that he wants me to do, but I don't have the ability to carry it out. What Paul is basically saying is that sin and slavery and us are kind of like fish and water. Fish don't have the ability to breathe outside of the water. In the same way, when it comes to sin, we don't have the ability to fight it. He says this, he goes on to say this, "For I do not do the good that I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing." He's very irritated there. I want you to see that what Paul's view on sin is. It's slavery. It's in control of you. There's a famous passage in Genesis 4 where Cain is about to kill Abel. You might know that story. And God comes to Cain and he says to Cain, "Watch out because sin is crouching at the door and it wants to get you." I want you to see there's a predominant view in Scripture that sin is a slave master. It is something that dominates and controls you, and left alone, we don't have the ability to fight it. Sin is slavery. Let's kind of just break this down a little bit, even a little bit more, just so that we kind of understand this. Okay? I got really interested in this topic because sin is fascinating. Because we all struggle with it, and like if you understand how we struggle with it, then you can understand better how to fight it. And I was for a time obsessed with that. I heard somebody talk about sin in the context of addiction. That sin is slavery, just like addiction is slavery. So I got really interested in that, and then I downloaded this lecture series on the nature of addiction, which, nerd, but it's super interesting. Because here's the thing, the process of addiction is almost identical to the process of how sin works for us. I don't have time to take you through the whole thing, but I want to give you one of the highlights. So one of the key things about addiction is that you're faced, as an addicted person, with something that's overwhelming you. This could be pain and like a wounding that you've experienced in your life and the grief from that loss or the pain from that wound. It's overwhelming to you, and so you look for an escape. Escape is one of the biggest words when we're talking about addiction. You look for an escape from these negative feelings, so then you turn to a substance. And that substance, or gambling, or online shopping, or pornography, or Netflix, convicting, what that does is it provides a temporary and meaningful escape from that overwhelming feeling. It's temporary, it doesn't last forever, but it is meaningful. You do get to escape from it. But the problem is that when you go to do it again, it doesn't work as good. So you got to ramp up your dosage. And that's why, people start usually with using once, and then all of a sudden they're completely addicted because they need to get back to that escape, but they can't because they have to take more and more in order to get back there. And so then they're caught in this cycle of addiction. That's kind of the process of addiction. Sin works almost exactly the same way. The time when you're the most tempted to sin is when you're stressed out. So let me give you this example. How many of you are in a relationship? Anybody? Super duper. How many of you have ever been in a relationship? Super duper. So you understand this, what I'm about to say. There are moments in relationships in which we feel overwhelmed by the other person. Maybe they're angry at us, and they're like, arguing, and the argument is ramping up, and we're beginning to feel a little overwhelmed. Or, maybe maybe they've sinned against you. They've done something, and we feel overwhelmed by those feelings. In that moment, there are two types of sinful responses. You can either overpower them by sinning, and you get angry and you ramp up and you cuss them out and you put them down, or you can withdraw. You can kind of walk away from that relationship. And so here's the thing. Some people are feeling convicted. Anyway, just kidding. And so here's what I want to show you. You're overwhelmed, so you choose a sinful response. When you respond sinfully like that, you get temporary but meaningful relief. You shut them down. They stopped. You don't feel overwhelmed anymore. Or you withdrew. You walked away. And you've removed yourself from the painful thing. Now, here's the thing. Over time, that becomes a strategy that we use. And all of a sudden, whenever we get into an argument, we need to either kill the person or walk away. But the problem is, it doesn't work as good as the first time. And so you got to get more angry, or you got to withdraw more. And so over time, what happens is you develop this sinful response that becomes sort of your go-to mechanism for dealing with the world. So here's what I want to show you. The process of addiction and the process of sin are almost exactly identical. Because why? Because sin is slavery. That's how it works. Somebody asked me recently a question that I was asked a couple years ago that I spent a lot of time thinking about because it was just an interesting question. They asked, what was the reward for the Pharisees? Think about how they lived their life. They were very strict. They didn't have any fun. Why was that good for them, right? What's the reward? The reward when you shut somebody down or withdraw is that you have a temporary relief from the overwhelming thing. What's the reward for the legalists? What's the reward for the strict rule followers? Here's the reward for the Pharisees. Superiority might be the most addictive thing that a human mind can latch itself onto. Being better than other people, man, people will be willing to give up so much if they can just be better than you. The idea of being better than somebody else and that superiority, often, when you go to churches that are very strict on the rules and don't talk about Jesus, they're all about sin and not about our Savior. Those churches and those people, I don't want to call anybody out, but here's the thing. What happens is when you're right and everybody else is wrong, and you know what's sin and everybody else doesn't, that makes you better than them. It's the most addictive thing in the world. All sin is an addictive process. It is slavery. That's the problem. So let me finish this portion with this thought. Some people know that they're slaves to sin, and some people don't. The people who know that they're slaves to sin, those are the people you want to be friends with because they know what's going on. They know what they struggle with. They're honest about their struggles. They're authentic. They're fighting it, It's the people who don't know that scare me. You don't know that when you treat people like that, it hurts them. You don't know that when you do X, Y, Z, it leads to this bunch of death in your life. It's the people who are unaware that are the scary ones. And so here's the thing. We want to be a culture where it's okay to not be okay. The only way that we can fight sin is if we're aware of the problem. And so, especially, I want to give a little plug to our life groups right now. There are so many. We have a couple groups that meet during the week. It's a great time to get into a community that loves you and that wants to be there for you. And one of the reasons that life groups can be so powerful is because people begin to share what their struggles are. Man, I struggle with anxiety. I struggle with depression. I struggle with pornography. I struggle with my rage. I struggle with my fear. I struggle with, and all of a sudden you're like, you too? I thought it was just me. This is great. So here's the thing. We want to be a church that is aware of the problem. Their story of slavery is our story. We all struggle with sin in some way, and it is always slavery. So that's the problem. Let's get to the solution. And let's begin with the plagues. Who loves plagues? Me. Okay, here's the thing. The plagues are found in chapters 7 through 11. I timed it. It takes me 20 minutes to read that to you. I'm not going to do that. You're welcome. You can do that later, and you should, because it's amazing. And it's just so interesting to see how God works. So here's what I want to do. I want to show you probably my favorite thing about the plagues. which is just like a weird statement. I want to show you my favorite thing, because here's the thing. God has these plagues. You know, you have like the Nile turns to blood, and there's darkness, and there's locusts, and there's hail, and there's all this like shiny stuff, you know? And I feel like when we talk about the plagues, we're like, ooh, look at the shiny stuff. It's a bit like the movie Transformers. Has anybody seen Transformers, the first one? That movie was like a bucket of garbage water, you know what I mean? Because like there's so many plot holes. I have so many questions. Why would the government give Shia LaBeouf a job? Unless it was chief dancer. I don't get that. You know, and then there's like, why these aliens come to Earth and then they choose to be cars? Weird. You know, that's like not explained. Okay, anyway. But they've made 6 Transformers movies. And here's why. Because the flash and the explosions and all the cars transforming into these things with swords, and he's got a really deep voice. It's so cool, you know? Like, nobody watches those movies because they have an airtight plot line, you know? They watch those movies because the explosions are cool. It's the same thing with the plagues. Wow, this is kind of a bad... I'm not denigrating the plagues, but here's the thing. It's cool that God did that, but there's so much more going on here. Whenever God does one thing, he's doing 1,000 things. I want to show you the thing that nobody ever talks about, and that's this, that in every plague, God is targeting one of the Egyptian gods, or several groups of the Egyptian gods. What God is doing with the plagues is he's showing Israel that he is more powerful than the gods of Egypt. He's showing Pharaoh that he is more powerful than the gods of Egypt. I want to highlight, here's a chart, sorry if you can't see it, it's small. But I want to highlight some of them. The first one, you know, you might know this. You've seen, what's that movie? Oh, The Prince of Egypt. You've probably seen the animated Moses one, right? Or maybe you saw the old one with that old guy that everybody knows his name, and I can't remember his name. Thank you, Heston dude. Anyway, the Nile, you might have seen this, the Nile turns to blood. The Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt. It is like the main river. It feeds all of their crops. It was also said in Egyptian mythology that Osiris, who's one of their main gods, that the Nile was his bloodstream. So you got to see what God's doing when he turns the Nile to blood. What he's saying is, I can make your gods bleed. One of my other favorite ones is the frogs. That's the second one, because I was always confused about that when I was little, you know, because it's like, oh, frogs are kind of cool, and they're cute, and you hold them, you know, and sometimes they pee in your hand, but whatever, you know, and you're just like, that's when you give it to your sister. But the plague of frogs is that there's so many frogs that they're under your pillow, they're in your soup, ew. You know, they're just like, they're everywhere. Here's the interesting thing. The Egyptians had 2 goddesses that were the symbols of fertility. In Western culture, symbols of fertility are bunnies. You've heard the phrases, you know, they have a lot of kids, like bunnies. You know, so anyway, in Egyptian culture, it wasn't bunnies, it was frogs. And if you've ever had a pond when you were growing up like I did, what you know is that, like, man, they explode. There's a ton of frogs. So they're good symbols of fertility, right? So they had these 2 goddesses who they had a frog's head, like, you know how the Egyptian gods all had, like, weird animal heads? Anyway, so when God makes this overabundance of frogs, what he's saying is, your gods aren't in control of the frogs. I am. Your gods are not as powerful as I am. I want to show you this last one, my last favorite one, not the last one. Plague number 9 is darkness. Probably the chief Egyptian god, kind of like the Greek chief god is Zeus. The chief Egyptian god is Ra. He's the sun god. He's also the protector of Pharaoh. He's like, and Pharaoh is said to be a descendant of Ra, and so he's kind of an important god. But he's the god of the sun. And so when God turns the land to darkness, here's what he's saying. Your strongest God has got nothing on me. I am in complete control of this situation. And what's so cool about this is that when God goes to deliver his people from slavery, the first thing that he does is he breaks the power of the Egyptian gods. Now remember this, their story is our story. This is so much like what happens when you and I are brought from death to life. Paul says in Ephesians 2 that when we are saved, we move from death to life, from darkness to light. There's something we've left behind, and there's something we're going to. Their freedom, they went from slavery to free. Their freedom is just like our freedom. And so here's the thing. Jesus says when nobody can come to the Father unless the Father draws him. Part of what happens when we are saved is that God is pulling us out of darkness and into light. He's pulling us out of death and into life. He's pulling us out of slavery and into freedom. Their story is our story. Part of when we are saved, part of what's happening is that God is breaking the power of the idols that we so dearly harbor in our hearts. Here's what I mean by that. All of us have something that we like to worship other than God. Those are called idols. And God doesn't like them in the Old Testament. If you read that, he gets pretty irritated. Understandable. Because all of our sins stem from an idolatry. And so when God wants to free us from the slavery of sin, what he has to do is break the power of the idols in our heart. So here's what this looks like. Let me just be very practical for a second. So, maybe you've heard of, or maybe you are, the kind of person who really likes what other people think of them. You know, like people pleaser is kind of the phrase. And when people have a harsh opinion of you, it's devastating, right? Part of what happens when we're saved is that we have to go from worshiping people's opinion of ourselves to worshiping the God of the universe. And what you'll often see in deliverance when God changes your heart is that the things that you used to worship all of a sudden start letting you down. It's a part of him pulling you into the light. It's a part of him showing you that this way of life is not good. It's hard to live in slavery, and it's so much better to live in freedom. I want to show you for a second kind of how idols just work. Can we throw that chart up there? So here's a little bit of information. This is like, I'm going to give you like a pastoral counseling session, so start getting excited. Okay, so whenever we think about idols, we often think of stuff, like people worship money, right? Or like people worship their possessions, their things, like we guard those things very dearly. We often think of stuff, but idols go way deeper. And to kind of illustrate that, I'd like to just kind of get us all on the same page here. So let's kind of do a case study. So let's, in your mind, imagine a middle-aged man who has lost his hair and he's gaining weight. And then all of a sudden he decides he wants to make a major purchase. What's he buying? A Corvette, a car, exactly. Exactly. We all know what's going on there, right? Here's the thing. Have you ever met that person and then smudged their car? Boy, you'll figure out what his idol is real fast. You know what I mean? So here's the thing. Sometimes we focus on the stuff. We say, like, the car is his idol, but there's more going on there, okay? Underneath the worship of stuff is a fixation. Very often, well, let's just take this story, for example. Very often, middle age is hard because you're not young anymore. And especially in our culture, we really worship youth, you know? Like all of the cool people are 25 and under. Like Shawn Mendes, what? He's a cool person. Anyway, and we have this whole industry to help you reverse the signs of aging. It's called plastic surgery, right? We kind of have an idol or a fixation on youth, and that's kind of, sometimes at least, I don't want to generalize, but sometimes that's what's underneath the worship of this car is a fixation on regaining youth. I need to be cool again. It used to be that I knew all the cool slang words, but nobody says dude anymore. Weird, you know? So you have this kind of fixation on youth. What that comes out of, it goes deeper though. What that often comes out of is a core longing, something that you long for in your life. This could be safety, this could be significance, this could be success, this could be power. There are things that we all kind of long for deeply in our lives. And so let's just pick one of those, like significance works really easy for this. If at some point in this man's life, he learned that in order to be a good person, you have to be cool, you have to be attractive, you have to be, in order to have significance, you got to be the guy. You know what I mean? So he longs for significance. In order to get that significance, he fixates on youth because that's cool. In order to get that youth, he buys the thing. Does that make sense? Okay, this all goes even deeper though. Some of you are like, oh man, this is annoying. It's going to be done soon. In the middle is the idea of self. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to ourselves, there are two ways that we can idolize ourselves. You can think of yourself, or think too highly of yourself, I mean. That's arrogance. That's that superiority thing we were talking about earlier. Or you can have an inferiority problem. You can think of yourself so little that you lack so much that the focus of your life becomes filling that hole. In both of those scenarios, the only person you're thinking of is yourself. And so it used to be thought that all sin comes from arrogance, right? Like, I'm better than you, and that's why I can take your stuff. But really, that's been debunked. Most sin comes out of an inferiority complex. I lack something that I need, and so I have to do X, Y, Z in order to get that. That's what most self-idolatry comes out of. Now, here's why this is important. Why did I just go through all of that? Because here's the thing. Their story is our story. Their freedom is our freedom. And so here's the key thing. When God goes to free his people, he breaks the power of the idols. What you have to know is that if you're struggling with sin, and you are, if you're struggling with sin in your life and you're experiencing the results of sin, which is like death, like things are breaking down, your career isn't going as well as you wanted it to, your relationship isn't going as well as you wanted it to, things are dying, much like the plants in my office. They're dying. The cause of that is sin. It's your sin or somebody else's sin, but the cause of sin is idolatry. And if you know that chain of events, I'm worshiping the wrong thing, therefore I'm acting in the wrong way, therefore I'm hurting the people, myself and God all around me. If you know that chain of events, then guess what you can do? You can stop it. You can go to the root of it to pull out. Has anybody ever, I was weeding, this was a couple weeks ago, and I hate that. That's the worst thing in the world, is weeding. And I pulled out this one thing, I don't even know what it was, and I pulled it out, and the root was seriously like 3 feet long, and I was like, holy crap. That's kind of like how sin works. The root that goes down to the core of who we are is these idols. It's what we worship, it's what we value over God. Those are the plagues. God frees his people by destroying the power, through the plagues, by destroying the power of the gods of Egypt. Let's continue, and I want to show you the Passover, because this is where the cool stuff is. If you're like, oh, that was cool, this is cooler. This is from Exodus 12. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of all months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." It's like kind of like, thanks, God, for repeating yourself. I get it now. You're very clear. "Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for each household." That's kind of how it's supposed to work. Each household, according to your father, has a lamb. "And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat, and you shall make your count for the lamb." So God's saying everybody's involved in this. Even if you can't afford a lamb, go to your neighbor's house. You guys will figure it out. He says, "Your lamb shall be without blemish." Blemish is an impurity it's going to be the whitest lamb ever. There's nothing wrong with it. A male, a year old, you may take it from the sheep or the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. So the lamb's going to be in your house 4 days. "When the whole assembly in the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight." That took a turn for the worse for the lamb. "Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all of the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on the gods of Egypt I will execute my judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall befall you or destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." I want you to see this. God's setting up the Passover. This is the 10th plague where the firstborn's about to die. And what he says is, I'm going to skip over every house that has a sacrificial lamb inside of it, and they put the blood on the special things and they blood stuff. Words. So here's the thing. God's saying, I'm going to look at that blood and I'm going to pass over. This is Israel's story. It's beautiful because what God is doing is he's saving his son. He's saving his daughters. He's saving his family. But what's cool about this is that their story is our story. See, their story is our story, except we have a worse slavery. By that, I don't mean that ours is more painful necessarily. What I mean by that is that their slavery was forced upon them by somebody else. Our slavery, when you look at Romans 6, our slavery is our fault. Like we willingly subject ourselves to sin. That's worse. That's harder Because it doesn't mean that I'm suffering injustice. What it means is when I experience the consequences of sin, what that means is I got nobody to blame. We have a worse slavery, but there's good news. We have a better deliverer. We have a better deliverer. See, in the Passover story, there is a man, Moses. He's sent from God to deliver the people. But the problem with Moses is that a couple of years before this, he murdered a guy. He murdered somebody. He's a murderer. That's not great, right? And then he wrestles with God's like, hey, you're going to go save my people. And Moses is like, I don't want to, God. I really don't want to. And then he has these like excuses. And finally, in the end, Moses says, nah. I just don't want to do it. And then God says, no, you're going to do it. So then Moses does it. All right, so that's like the Passover story. However, in the gospel, we have a better man. We have a man who wrestles with God in the garden over the cross and says, God, I don't want to do this. But in the end, he doesn't refuse. He says, nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. In the Passover story, we have a prince of Egypt, who comes to deliver his people from slavery, a temporal slavery, a temporary slavery here on earth. In the gospel, we have a heavenly prince who comes to deliver us for eternity. In the Passover story, we have a miracle that starts the whole thing, the burning bush, right? So you have this bush and it's on fire, but it's not consumed. In the gospel, we have a God who died and yet lived. In the Passover, we have a prophet, Moses, who is sent to his people to deliver the word of God, but in the gospel, the word became flesh so he could dwell among us and so that we could know him personally. In the Passover, we have a representation of God who's going to kill, steal, destroy, do whatever he needs to do to save his people. But in the gospel, we have a fuller representation of what God is, a God who is no longer willing to let people pay the price for their sins anymore, a God who wants to take the sin upon himself. It is a God who is righteous and just, but who is also loving and merciful. In the Passover story, we have a sacrificial lamb, a lamb by whose death they could live. In the gospel, we have a lamb who is more perfect, more pure, who by whose death we now live. In the Passover, there is a blood that's sprinkled on the door frames that leads to then throughout the year they'd have to sacrifice more and more, all this blood to cover all these sins. In the gospel, we have a blood that covers us once and for all. In the Passover, there's a son who dies, many sons who die, the firstborn sons. They all die. In the gospel, we have one son who says, I'm not going to let any other sons die. I'm going to die for them. That story is our story, but our story is a little bit better. But when we marry these two together, what we see is a full picture of who God is. A God who is willing to who is not willing to let you die for your sin, but who is willing to die for you. A God who wants to take your place. And that's a better deliverer. We have a worse slavery, but a better deliverer. As the band comes up, I just want to share this last point. You've probably heard and seen the parting of the Red Sea, right? What's so cool about that story is that Israel is free. The death of the son has allowed them now to be free because Pharaoh doesn't want to keep them anymore. So they go out and they take their first steps into freedom, but the death that they walked out of, it wants to come back. The slave owner wants to enslave them again. And what we see at the Red Sea is a God who says, no, I delivered them and they will be delivered. And here's what you need to know, because I know that there are some people here who are really struggling with their sin, who know that, but man, when I say it's like an addiction, you know that it is like an addiction. When Paul says, I don't do the good that I want to do, but I end up doing the bad that I don't want to do, you're just kind of like, yes, that's me. What you have to know is that the God who brought you from death to life, from slave to free, is not going to let you be re-enslaved. What we believe in the gospel is that he's coming again. Right now, we're kind of fighting our sin and the slave master. Right now, we're in a battle with that, but there's going to come a time when he comes again to put it to death forever. Part of the good news of Jesus is that he's coming to right what is wrong in the world. He's coming to restore all things. He's coming to make things beautiful again. He's coming to make us look more like him so that we don't struggle with this slave owner anymore. he's coming to save us. And the cool thing about God parting the Red Sea is he's willing to do miraculous things to make sure that you know that he's coming to save you. We're going to sing this next song, and I want to invite you to go ahead and stand up now. I want to invite you as you stand to dwell on the fact that God is a deliverer. Part of what that means is that sometimes when we feel out of control, when we feel like there's nothing we can do, it is God who steps in to make a way. And as we kind of meditate on that, let's sing this next song.